The Dalai Lama turned 90 last week, raising questions around the role of China in naming his successor and Tibetan independence as a whole. But what is the real history of Tibet and the institution of the Dalai Lama beyond just U.S. headlines? We'll discuss this and more on this week's China Report. Welcome to the China Report, made in collaboration with Pivot to Peace. Every week, we'll be helping you sort through the propaganda with an independent view of the country that we're taught to hate, but know so little about. I'm your host, Amanda Yee. These are this week's headlines. Taiwan kicked off its largest ever military drills last Wednesday. The annual 10-day Han Kuang drills, which simulate war with the mainland, mobilized 22,000 reservists, the largest number ever in the 41-year history of these exercises. This year's live-fire component is also the longest ever, signaling an escalation in cross-strait relations. For the first time, the drills featured Taiwan-developed Sky Sword surface-to-air missiles and new U.S.-supplied high-mobility artillery rocket systems made by Lockheed Martin. The weapons, which have a range of about 300 kilometers or 190 miles, carry the ability to strike coastal targets in China's southern province of Fujian on the other side of the Taiwan Strait. At a news conference, Chinese Defense Ministry spokesperson Colonel Zhang Bing said, "The Han Kuang exercise is nothing but a bluffing and self-deceiving trick by the Democratic Progressive Party authorities attempting to bind the Taiwanese people to the Taiwanese independence cart and harm Taiwan for the selfish interests of one party." China and Brazil have signed deals to expand their partnership. On Saturday, July 6th, Chinese Premier Li Qiang met with Brazilian President Lula da Silva in Rio de Janeiro ahead of the 17th annual BRICS summit. The two signed a number of agreements to promote bilateral ties ranging from cooperation in infrastructure, pharmaceuticals, new energy, AI, to development strategy alignment. Lula said that Brazil is ready to promote exchanges and cooperation with China in areas such as economy and trade, science and technology, and finance and aerospace, and also seeks to deepen collaboration in addressing climate change. Li called for both countries to step up cooperation in education, youth, healthcare, and other areas, further facilitating people-to-people exchanges and strengthen public support for China-Brazil cooperation. Chinese scientists have created a Cyborg bee with the world's lightest brain controller. The brain controller device weighs only 74 milligrams, lighter than a sack of nectar, and was built by Professor Zhao Jiling's team at the Beijing Institute of Technology. Strapped to the bee's back, the device pierces its brain with these 3 needles using electronic pulses to command flight. Turn left, turn right, advance, and retreat. 9 times out of 10, the bees obeyed. According to a peer-reviewed paper published in the Chinese Journal of Mechanical Engineering in mid-June, cyborg bees could serve as military scouts or search for survivors in the aftermath of a natural disaster. Before this, the lightest cyborg controller came from Singapore and was triple the weight. It could command beetles and roaches, but they crawled at slow speeds and short ranges and grew tired quickly. Zhao's team studied bee wings and cockroach turns, mapping out signals to motion and commanding bees to fly in different directions and roaches to trace long, straight paths with little deviation. Still, some flaws remain. Bees need wired power and roaches tire after about 10 zaps. Also, according to the researchers, one signal sometimes stirs different moves in different bugs. And a long-lasting battery weighs 600 milligrams, which is far too heavy for a bee to carry. Bees' legs and bellies also refuse some of the commands. The research team aims to improve precision repeatability of insect behavior control through further optimizing simulation, signals, and control techniques. Citizens from 74 countries can now enter China for up to 30 days without a visa. The government has been steadily expanding visa-free entry to boost its tourism and economy. Over 20 million foreign visitors entered China without a visa in 2024, almost 1/3 of total visitors and more than double from the previous year, according to the National Immigration Administration. In December of 2023, China announced visa-free entry for citizens of France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Spain, and Malaysia. Almost all of Europe has been added since then. Travelers from 5 Latin American countries and Uzbekistan became eligible last month, followed by 4 in the Middle East. The total will grow to 75 on July 16th with the addition of Azerbaijan. About 2/3 of the countries have been granted visa-free entry on a one-year trial basis. While the United States is not on this list, it is among 54 countries that is allowed for up to 10 days without a visa, so long as they depart for a different country afterward. The Dalai Lama held celebrations for his 90th birthday last week. In the Western world, the Dalai Lama has become a symbol of Tibetan culture and autonomy, while Beijing has accused him of being a separatist and inciting unrest. What's the real story? To discuss the real history of Tibet, we are honored to have back on Ken Hammond. Ken is a professor of East Asian and Global History at New Mexico State University. Ken, welcome back to the China Report.
Hey, delighted to be here, Amanda.
Well, it's really good to have you. Like I said, the Dalai Lama is a really popular figure in the West. He's often seen as a symbol of peace, love, and compassion. And we even have this really romanticized notion of Tibet in the popular imagination. But these two images are themselves, products of U.S. propaganda. So I was wondering if you could get started by telling us a little bit of history of Old Tibet, pre-1950, before the arrival of the PLA, and what the institution of the Dalai Lama represented in that society.
Sure. I mean, you're quite right. Tibet, for most Americans, is kind of a fantasy land. It's a place where a lot of people project, I think, their own wishes for a society that's peaceful and happy and all that kind of stuff. But that's a far cry from the realities of life for the vast majority of people in Tibet under the old regime. I think that what most Americans don't think about is that Tibet was a theocratic state. That is to say, it was a state in which there was no separation between church and state. It was compulsory, basically, for everyone to adhere to the particular forms of Buddhism that were practiced in Tibet. And the religious authority was the state. They constituted state power. So it wasn't a society that was free and open for all kinds of activities or discussions or beliefs. It was a very, very constrained system. And perhaps even more importantly, it was a system in which the monasteries, the religious establishments, were the real economic and social power. They owned the vast, quantities of land. Lots of young men were drawn into the monasteries to be monks. The monasteries possessed great wealth, and they used that wealth to exercise power and authority over, all the people who lived across the land. It's not a huge population in Tibet, but the hierarchy within the society was quite stark between those at the top and the vast majority of the population. So, we need to understand traditional, if you will, traditional Tibetan society as one in which, most people were bound to the land on which they worked. They often worked on land that was owned by monasteries. It was not a society where there was a lot of mobility amongst people. It was in many ways a very unfree society. And yes, it was a place. I mean, it's a beautiful country. It's a wonderful landscape, and there's much in the art and culture of the traditional society to be admired. But we shouldn't have this kind of romanticized image of Tibet as a place where everybody was happy. Certainly, the elites were probably pretty happy, but a lot of people that was based upon the suffering and the production by the majority of people. A lot of people lived lives that were very, very difficult and very, very harsh. And I think that this image of happy Tibet prior to 1950 is, as I say, it's kind of a fantasy land that exists more in the minds of Americans and other Westerners than it ever did in the realities of life in Tibet.
Mm. So Tibet pre-1950 was a feudal theocratic society. And then in 1949, the Chinese Revolution happened. And then in 1950, the PLA was the arrival of the PLA in Tibet. And correct me if I'm wrong, but in 1951, Tibet and China signed an agreement which acknowledged China's sovereignty over Tibet. And then in the later 1950s, there was a Tibetan uprising against China, which was largely stoked by the CIA. So, can you talk a little bit more about this period, the Tibetan revolt, what led to it, and also the U.S. government's role in this uprising?
Sure. I mean, the 1950s were a very interesting time in Tibet because, of course, in 1949, with the establishment of the People's Republic, the new government becomes, in effect, the successors to the Republic and also to the old Qing dynasty. And they inherited the political frontiers, the borders that had come down from, the 18th, 19th century. And of course that included Tibet. Tibet has a long history of interaction with the central Chinese state, and certainly from at least the 17th century on, it was an integral part of the Qing dynasty, and then it was recognized as part of the Republic of China. And after liberation, when the People's Republic comes along, its territory is part of China. And so the entry of the People's Liberation Army into Tibet in 1950, which in the West is often characterized as an invasion, it's simply the extension of the authority of the central government over the territories that it was responsible for. There's nothing sinister about it. It's a logical move, concluding the process of the establishment of the PLA, of the People's Republic, rather. So the 50s then become a period where, you know, Tibet is part of China, but it has a distinctive local culture. And of course a language. There are language differences. Tibetan is part of the what's called Sino-Tibetan language family, but it's a very different language than Mandarin Chinese or most of the dialects in China. So the process of developing the new society and developing, the new systems in China, it proceeded in a way that tried to be very sensitive to local circumstances, to local conditions, not just in Tibet, in other parts of the country as well, up in the Northeast, in Manchuria, in Mongolia, out in Xinjiang, wherever there were large ethnic communities that were not part of the mainstream Han population. The central government tried to work with them in a variety of ways. And in Tibet, that was a particularly sensitive process. So there's an agreement, as you said, signed in 1951. The Dalai Lama, who was, of course, a young man at that time, but still representing the Tibetan government, goes to Beijing, meets with Mao Zedong and others, and that agreement recognizes and confirms Tibet's position as part of the People's Republic. But during the 1950s, a lot of things were changing in much of China. The development of agricultural cooperatives and collectives and things like that, the beginnings of industrialization, the efforts to start to create a socialist economy, a socialist society. That's all getting going through the 1950s in much of China, but not in Tibet. The agreement with the local authorities in Tibet was that Tibet would have a high degree of autonomy, as it is put, um, and that the central government would defer many of its political initiatives for a while at least. Okay, and so land reform, agricultural cooperatives and collectivization, other things like that, those do not apply up in Tibet, right? And indeed, they didn't apply in a number of other areas, ethnic minority areas, but certainly they did not apply in Tibet. And by the late 1950s, when the processes of socialist development start to accelerate, um, there are rumors that begin to be spread in Tibet that suddenly China is going to impose all these new policies and it's going to radically transform the conditions in Tibet. That was not true. The central government did not have those intentions, was not taking those initiatives, was still respecting, a lot of the autonomy in Tibet. But those rumors sparked a rebellion in March of 1959. Well, where did those rumors come from? They were not based upon the realities of what was happening in China. They were introduced, at least in part and in a great part, by agents who were infiltrated into Tibet by the American CIA. We know this from not just the things that were said at the time by the Chinese authorities, but we know this from the writings of people who participated in training these agents in the United States. The CIA maintained a training facility in Colorado. They brought over agents, from the Tibetan community in exile in India, and put them through various training processes. And then they were infiltrated back in, usually over the border from Nepal, to carry out, psychological activities to promote these myths about China's destruction of Tibetan culture and all this. And that contributed significantly to the unrest that broke out in March of 1959. Now, when that happened, when people, mostly led by monks from some of the monasteries in and around Lhasa, began to attack Chinese citizens, from the inner provinces, and PLA forces. Obviously, the central government sent in reinforcements, and they brought the situation back under control. During that unrest, that's the moment at which the Dalai Lama chooses to depart from China and goes over the mountains down into India, where he has, of course, been based ever since. That creates a situation in which China still does not apply the same policies that governed much of the rest of the country, but it does bring Tibet under a greater degree of central government supervision, and of course that also involves the beginnings of some social transformations in Tibet, which had been deferred in that first phase.
I know you're a historian of China, and I know you visited Tibet before. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about some of the reforms that were introduced after the Dalai Lama fled to India, and the reforms that were introduced in the decades since.
Sure. I mean, the 60s, of course, was a time of some transformations. Interestingly, both in sort of the inner provinces of China, but also up in Tibet. The central government does begin to supervise a process of land reform in which the concentrated land holdings of the monasteries were broken up. The monasteries were not shut down or anything like that, but a lot of the land that had been basically rented or used for tenant farming, things like that, that's redistributed to the farmers who were working that land, who were living on that land, and that was in line with policies that had been applied in China a decade before. But that begins to create new opportunities for many people in Tibet. Certainly, the farming population now is in control of its land, its own land. Titles come into the hands of the tillers, the people actually farming, and they begin to be able to enhance their productivity. The central government, central authorities are providing advice and assistance, material assistance to farmers. So there's an expansion of agricultural production, and I think that was very beneficial for many, many, many people who previously had simply been, the serfs of the monastic establishments. Obviously, the monastic authorities were not happy about that. But this was a situation that had began to win the support of the vast majority of people. The central government, of course, also begins to invest in building of roads. It develops the airport at Gungar outside of Lhasa. It's beginning to work on infrastructure projects. And it's not attacking the core culture of Tibet. They're, as I say, they're not shutting down the monasteries. People are still going about their business. Ordinary people that still, are engaged with Buddhism are perfectly free to go about their activities. But there is a process of social change that is the result, in many ways, simply of the introduction of new people, new knowledge, new infrastructure, the roads. It's easier to move around. It's easier to move goods around. The economy begins to develop. So those reforms have a very, very positive impact. They also, of course, begin to offer educational opportunities. Universities are opened up. The educational system, which had, of course, entirely been in the hands of the monasteries, that can still go on. Many students continue to go to the monasteries, but now there are public schools as well, and students, young people, are encouraged to attend them. Education is bilingual. The Tibetan language is still taught, and of course, it's still taught today. But they also offer instruction in Chinese because Tibet is part of China. And if Tibetan people want to be part of the modernization and the development of China, it's helpful for them to be able to speak and read Chinese. So there's reforms, and obviously reforms are changes. They don't take Tibet and make it a kind of theme park of a frozen society that's never going to change. They extend the livelihood of people, better medical care. They build hospitals, better educational opportunities, better infrastructure for economic development. These policies are introduced, and this isn't something that happens just immediately after the flight of the Dalai Lama. This is something that goes on and really continues to go on today. Tibet today has come to be connected to the inner provinces by a railway. It's much easier to travel up there now, and it's much easier for Tibetan people to travel out and to see other parts of China, and indeed to travel out to the wider world. These things have changed Tibet, but it's not a matter of going in to destroy the either the Buddhist religion or the ancient culture. You go to Tibet today, you visit the monasteries, you go to Lhasa, you see the great pilgrimage destinations there, and there's thousands and thousands of people thronging around the Jokang, the central sort of temple in Lhasa, and it's a very lively and dynamic society. But it's a society now that has many modern facilities, many modern opportunities, and it's much more integrated into with the rest of the world. It's not just this isolated little place up in the remote plateau where everybody had to do what the lamas said. So there's been a great deal of transformation, but it has not fundamentally altered the essences of Tibetan culture. It's taken away the power and the hierarchy that was associated with monastic dominance, but it hasn't changed the lives, the sort of cultural lives, spiritual lives of most Tibetan people in any very fundamental way.
Mm. A few minutes ago, you were talking about the CIA's role in stoking the Tibetan uprising, and I want to return to that for a second. I think it's also important to point out that even after exile, there was still CIA intervention in Tibet. The Dalai Lama was on the CIA payroll for a number of years, and as you said, they were training Tibetan separatists in Colorado. And I think the CIA funding ended sometime in the 70s, but even after that, the NED was kind of pumping money into, these Tibetan houses, Tibetan language newspapers to try and, stoke a separatist movement to break it away from China. And even as a kid growing up in the 90s, I remember very vividly the Free Tibet movement. It was everywhere, right? There were benefit concerts. The cause was championed by celebrities. And to me, it just seems like this is the same US playbook every time. They try to find some kind of internal issue which they can stoke and exploit in China, and then they fund these separatist movements in hopes of igniting an uprising that'll break the region away from the central government and roll back the gains of the revolution. So I'm wondering, do you see any similarities between what the U.S. did in Tibet and more recent things like the propaganda around Xinjiang or even Taiwan?
Yeah, sure. I think that you're quite right that there's a very consistent narrative that has been pushed by American political elites, for decades now, which tries to portray China as a place where ethnic minorities and especially, of course, Tibetans and Muslims in Xinjiang are being systematically oppressed, and their culture, their religion is being destroyed, and that's something that the Chinese government is intent upon, and we just need to constantly expose that and criticize that and use that to condemn China. And it's one of those narratives that if you continue to push it, both through sort of overt means, but also through covert means, then it becomes kind of the conventional wisdom. I think that many people in America, if you ask them about Tibet, they'd say, "Oh yes, that's a terrible place, because they're destroying all the religion there." Or the same thing they would say about Xinjiang. "Oh, it's just so bad there," and that's of course completely inconsistent with the realities of those places, both in Xinjiang and in Tibet. Certainly there are changes taking place, especially for young people. They're interested in the modern world. They're interested in having the things that young people everywhere want to have. And maybe they're less interested in some of the traditions, some of the expectations that older generations had about, becoming monks or nuns or something like that. Same thing the Catholic Church faces in a lot of countries, especially in America. But that narrative that American political elites promote simply is wrong as far as what's happening in the lives of the vast majority of people in Xinjiang, in Tibet, in China as a whole. The country is developing, the livelihoods of people have been improved. I mean, we can go on and on about the developments that have taken place in China, in all of China. But, you know, we always have to remember that China's successes, China's development, China's re-emergence in the world as an economic powerhouse and as a model perhaps for other countries, and as a country that has some influence in the affairs of other parts of the world, and certainly of its neighbors. As well it should. Um, that's a reality that those same American political elites fear. They are the people who have benefited from American imperialism for what, 70 years now and more. And they don't want to see that end. They don't want to lose the power and the privileges and the perks that they've had, that they've enjoyed. So they don't like China's successes. And if they can find things to beat China with, to attack China with, then maybe they can slow China down. Maybe they can even derail China's development. That's a foolish idea. It's a fool's errand that they're embarked upon, but they don't seem to be able to get past that. They don't seem to be able to understand that China is a reality and the changes taking place in the world today are a reality that they're not going to stop, right? And so these anti-China campaigns, these distortions, these phony allegations about the situation in Tibet or in Xinjiang, it's just not real, but they do a very good job of isolating the American people from real knowledge and information about China. They've shut down programs for cultural exchanges. They've shut down things like the Confucius Institutes. The opportunities for ordinary Americans to know about the realities of China have been greatly restricted by the American government. And that, if anybody's trying to control the narrative, if anybody's trying to put forward a propaganda line, it's the American government, because they're afraid that if Americans knew what was happening in China, what it's like here, that they would not want to be hostile to China. They might look at China and say, why can't we do that? Why can't we have better health care? Why can't we have high-speed rail? Why can't we have, more innovation, more creativity in our universities and in our enterprises? So they don't want that. And they'll use anything they can to try to attack China. And again, this romanticism, this fantasy of these minority societies as if they were somehow, you know, lovely places in the old days. That's what they use that's one of the things that they use to try to bash China and try to get Americans to accept the idea that China is our enemy, when in fact it is nothing of the sort.
Yeah, I mean, you talked about controlling the narrative. I don't know if you saw this, but back in January, the New York Times printed this longer article about how China was placing hundreds of thousands of Tibetan children in boarding schools and indoctrinating them with pro-Chinese propaganda. And, this article argued that the kids are not allowed to speak their Tibetan language. They're not allowed to practice their culture and their beliefs. And it's the same kind of cultural genocide argument that's used in Xinjiang, right? And I think what was most insidious about this article was that they compared these schools to residential schools in the US, Canada, and Australia. And they compared it to these countries forcibly removing indigenous children from their families and placing them in these schools as part of their genocide against the native populations. But the New York Times article, it argued that, while these Western countries have come to reckon with their past, this is something that China is doing right now in the present. It's practicing cultural genocide right now. So I guess I'm wondering, how would you respond to these allegations of cultural genocide that, China is practicing settler colonialism in Tibet, the same way that the U.S. In the same way that the U.S. did.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's an element of almost humor in that whole narrative, because we know what we did, and we can only assume that other countries, other societies will conduct themselves with the same degree of barbarism that has been characteristic of the United States. The racism, the appropriation, expropriation of native lands, the whole reservation system, which still exists today. I mean, in America, I live in New Mexico. I live in a state that has vast indigenous, realms, the Navajo Nation, the Hopi, we have Apache lands and all this. And if you live in New Mexico, you become very familiar with the way in which the United States inflicted violence on these people and created the situation they have today. And the idea that somehow, oh, but that's all in the past. Everything's just fine today. Of course, that's a lie as well. The conditions for many Native Americans continue to be far below those that the white population has. I mean, that's the idea that somehow the New York Times can say, well, this happened in the past, but we've learned from our mistakes and we've rectified all that. That, of course, that's nonsense all by itself. But it's that projection of that same mentality onto the Chinese government that is kind of it's that's the most appalling part of it. I'm sure that there are boarding schools in Tibet. And one reason for that is because the Tibetan population is scattered over a vast plateau. It's not a very dense population, and there are great distances between facilities. People living out in villages, if their kids are going to get an education and they're going to go to a school, there's not a school every 5 miles. Some places you have to go long distances to get to the school. They're not going to go back and forth every day. I mean, that's just a reality that isn't particular to Tibet. That's something that we see in other parts of China, in other parts of Asia, where there are scattered populations, and to establish infrastructure, educational infrastructure, it helps, to be able to have the children come and be. Yes, they're boarding in school. That doesn't mean they don't go home on the weekend. It doesn't mean they never see their parents, and it particularly doesn't mean that they're cut off from their culture. China's very clear that education in the minority areas is bilingual. It's in their native language as well as in Chinese. Yes, they do take classes in Chinese. Yes, they are encouraged to learn Chinese. They're part of China. And for young people, many of whom want to take advantage of the opportunities of a modernizing economy, a growing economy, they want to get jobs, they want to improve their lives. Speaking Chinese is a valuable part of having those capabilities, right? So, yes, they do have boarding schools. Yes, there is instruction in Chinese, but there's also the preservation of Tibetan language, Uyghur language, Kazakh language, whatever it might be in these different minority areas. That's the reality. I mean, I've been in Tibet, I've been in Xinjiang, and it's not that there's never any friction or tension between Han Chinese and non-Han. Of course, there's going to be, but it is not a program of cultural genocide. It's not a program of trying to erase indigenous cultures. I'll tell you, in my view, to the degree to which young people are not enthusiastically embracing the old ways, and they're turning away from that. That's not because of the policies of the central government trying to indoctrinate them in some way. It's because they want the things, the products, the goods that modern culture brings. They want, they want to listen to music. They want to play video games. They want to have clothes that are cool, and those things, that's the modern world. I think many people in the West would be very happy if Tibet or Xinjiang could just be put in a little bubble and kept as kind of an amusing place. Maybe you could take vacations there and see the local people in their pretty colors, or something like that. There's this mentality that those people should be kept away from the benefits of modern life, right? And I just think that that's an inexcusable attitude, and it's based on ignorance rather than any kind of actual understanding of what's happening in this country here in China. I happen to be in China at the moment, so I say here, but I just think that that's a very different. There's such a gap between the realities of what goes on here and the propaganda that's put out about it back in the States. And that New York Times article is just part of that.
Mm. Well, going back full circle, the Dalai Lama celebrated his 90th birthday last week, and that put the question of Tibetan independence back in the spotlight. The Dalai Lama has confirmed that there will be a successor after he dies, and that successor will be born outside of China. Beijing, in response, has rejected this and said that his successor will be born in China, and he's also subject to the government's approval. And the U.S. government has, stated previously that China shouldn't interfere in naming this successor, and that Congress has already introduced a number of bills in the past affirming that. So do you see the question of the Dalai Lama's successor as another kind of geopolitical flashpoint over the next few years in U.S. China relations?
Well, certainly the Americans will try to make it one. I think it's, again, there's a humorous element in some of this stuff. You just kind of have to shake your head and laugh. The idea that the American government says that the Chinese government, which is the government of the territory that constitutes Tibet, shouldn't interfere in things that are happening in its own country. But it's okay for the Congress to pass a law interfering in the question of the proper succession of the Dalai Lama, right? I mean, how do they come up with this stuff? What is the cognitive acrobatics that allow them to think that that makes any kind of sense? You know, I mean, the question of succession, for the High Lamas is a complicated one. There's a long, long set of traditions and practices, the ways in which the present Dalai Lama, the 14th Dalai Lama, the way that he was identified, when the succession for the Banchen Lama took place, I don't know what, 25, 30 years ago now. That was a very contentious process, which the government in exile sabotage, right? There had been an agreement that had been worked out between both sides, between the government in exile and the central authorities in China, about how to manage that succession, and that had gone forward. And then the the government in exile took certain steps to try to preempt that process and sabotage the whole process. And clearly they're prepared to do that again. This idea that the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama, to the extent that we can talk about something like that, is already prescribed. That's going to take place outside China, and that only the government in exile has the authority to validate that. Well, okay, that's their position. That's their opinion. Religious authorities within Tibet, it may have different opinions. And certainly there are religious councils in Tibet that are prepared to oversee that succession process. They're prepared to undertake a search for a reincarnation. This is something that obviously they've done numerous times. Not just for the Dalai Lama, but for the Banchen Lama and for some other high lamas that are important reincarnations. So I think this is a process that the Tibetan people in Tibet may have their own ideas about. And the idea that again, that the United States is going to intervene and say, we can tell you how to run your religion, but the authorities in your own country, are not allowed to have anything to say about that. It's a ludicrous proposition. And so, but I do think, yes, that obviously the Americans, as I said a little while ago, they'll seize on anything that they can use to bash China. And so this issue of the succession for the Dalai Lama is certainly going to be hyped. It's going to be, there'll be all sorts of horrible stories. We'll dredge up the exile narratives about 1959. There'll be more glorification of, the old society when everything was better, even though people only lived to be 39 years old. I mean, yeah, we got a lot to look forward to in that regard.
All right. Well, that seems like a good place to end it. I know it's late in China where you are, so grateful for your time, and thank you for coming on the China Report again.
Well, it's been a delight to be here, and Of course, we wish the Tibetan people all the best as they prepare for this what's going to be an important transformation up there, a more important succession issue
Mhm.
for many of them. So I think that's we'll try to keep cool heads about that as the Americans get all cranked up. But it's been great to be here, and I've enjoyed the conversation. So thanks for having me back.
Well, all right, to end the show this week, we have a video that's been going viral on both Chinese social media and TikTok. It's from Guangzhou's Grandview Mall Aquarium, and the two Ukrainian underwater dancers you see here are performing the ballet adaptation of The Legend of the White Snake. And just as a reminder, if you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And we'll see you next week on the China Report.